Now, pre-formationist thought is not unique to the inheritance paradigm. Indeed, pre-formationism of one form or another has been characteristic of our thinking in the West about living systems since the scientific revolution. And there's a reason for that. And this is where I segue into part one, where I talk about the history. So going back to the scientific revolution, we have this moment where there's a break with the way things were, with the worldview that was dominant before the scientific revolution. And one of the key characteristics of this cosmology that came into this time is that the external world, the world that was knowable by men, by humans, was conceived to consist of bare matter moving through infinite space governed by the laws of mechanics. And spontaneity, formative potential, creativity, these things were evacuated from that world through this framework, making processes of formation all but unintelligible. Now the theorists at the time, especially the theorists of generation, which is what they called the process where a living being comes to be, they recognized that it would not be possible to explain the generation of living beings based purely on the laws of mechanics. So they had two choices. They could either appeal to vitalistic formative forces coming in real time and directing the developmental process towards some predetermined end, or they could push all formation back to the beginning of time and assume that at one moment God created every form, every living being that would ever live, and then he miniaturized them into tiny little folded up miniatures inside germs that were then nested one within the other like Russian dolls for every lineage back to the beginning, so that each new generation is just the outermost Russian doll growing to adulthood. And this is literal pre-formationism, and this is where the word was originally used to describe. And as absurd as this might seem to us, this was the only option that was considered to be reconcilable with Newtonian mechanics. So it was actually dominant from the end of the 17th century to almost the end of the 18th century. Now the inheritance paradigm did not really exist yet. So one of the points of my research, and especially the original historical research that I'm drawing on to make this point, is that the inheritance paradigm was constructed throughout this period. And I just want to mention a couple of the ingredients. So first of all, during the early modern period, we have plants and animals being uprooted from their natural places that they had existed for as long as anyone could remember, and being moved to new environments. And this is happening in agriculture, this is happening in botany. And so one of the things that people, especially individuals who are particularly interested, like selective breeders and naturalists, noticed that when this happened, they noticed that there were characteristics that were relatively independent of environmental conditions, and there were other characteristics that were relatively dependent on environmental conditions. Now, a few of the naturalists, like John Ray and Carl Linnaeus, they built this observation up into a rigid dichotomy between species type, which is absolutely independent of environmental conditions, and varieties, which are characters in varieties are generated by environmental conditions. Now, as soon as they had articulated this distinction, they started recognizing exceptions to it. So situations where what were thought to be varieties would then reproduce in different environments from where they originated. So they had to start figuring out how to deal with these exceptions. And what ended up happening was effectively they came up with a third category, which is characteristics that are not species characteristics or varieties, but are actually characteristics of a lineage. And in understanding characteristics in terms of the parents and the ancestors, they started relying gradually on inheritance metaphors. And so that was natural history. Now, in selective breeding, some analogous things happen, but I'm not going to talk about that because I don't have time. You're welcome to ask me about it. I'm going to move on to medicine. Medicine was hugely important here because the medical theorists developed or elaborated the internal structure of the inheritance paradigm. Developed some of the major distinctions and definitions that are still with us. And I'm going to mention just a couple. So first of all, the medical theorists in the late 18th century were particularly interested in distinguishing between hereditary diseases and other diseases that showed a family pattern of occurrence but weren't truly hereditary. And the way they did this is that they defined hereditary disease as a disease that is acquired at the moment of conception, which, as this was traditionally understood, it was the moment that the seminal fluids of the two parents mixed and solidified to form the rudiments of the individual constitution. And the constitution was considered to be stable after this point. So influences that came later, whether they're from intrauterine fluids or from the mother's milk or from early childhood experiences, would have relatively superficial effects because the constitution is pretty much fixed. And so this helped them explain why hereditary diseases, for example, are incurable. But it's important also to recognize that this definition of heredity is still with us, along with its implications of fixity and stability.